Freer Lyle. My dad was Harry J. Freer, and he was a descendant of the New Paltz Hugo Freer settler. And my mother was Anna Simon. My grandmother was Mary Helena Dillinger. And Grandma ended up owning the old homestead, which wasn't exactly on the lake. It was down at the foot of the lake, but it was owned by John Smith. Grandma's mother married John Smith, S-M-I-D-T-H, and left, when they passed away, they left the place to my grandmother, and it became the old homestead boarding house. There was a stone wall which kept the yard from falling into the road. It was alongside the road. That's about 3 feet high, stone wall. And on the other side of the road, there was a similar stone wall that kept cars from going in the pond, which was right across from the lake. It was only a small pond, but we kids had a great lot of fun on it. Dad made us a boat. He was a boat builder, in addition to being a carpenter and other chores. And he built us a boat. It was number 5 because there was 5 of us kids after his second marriage. I had a stepbrother and us 4 girls. And boat 5 was on the pond, and he didn't care what we did with it. We could tip it, we could jump out of it. The pond was about 1 foot deep. Of course, it was about 1 foot of mud in the bottom, too. And we caught catfish out of there, go under the bridge, holding onto the bridge stirrup, the structure, the steel structure overhead. And we'd hold on to that so we didn't go over the falls, which originally had a big mill. There was a big mill on that side of the road. And the water from the pond went through a mill wheel, which drove the grindstones. It was originally a flour mill. They made cornmeal and flour, ground up the grain that farmers would bring from the area, and made flour. And then they made straw paper out of straw for a while, and then the mill was defunct. When I was born, in 23, the mill was not in operation. It was still standing, because as we grew up, we used to play in that mill with the kids next door, and the kids up on the hill, the Leighton and Dennis kids, all came and we played in the old mill, which was fascinating, because the old mill wheel was still there, the dam was still there, and my father decided to take that mill down because he felt that it was too dangerous a playground for a bunch of wild Indians. So down came the mill. That was when I was about 6 or 7, that came down. Then the next place to us, going around the west side of the lake, was my Uncle George Dillinger, grandmother's brother. His boarding house, that was the Cliff House. And he built the dance hall. At one time, there were 3 dance halls on the lake. Uncle George Dillinger's was the last one. As you go up the line, there was Uncle George's house, then the Houck place, Mrs. Houck, and then my Uncle John Dillinger's place. That also had a name, but at the moment I don't know.
The Maples. Maple?
Yeah, yeah. And then my Uncle George owned some property with Uncle John, I think the 2 of them together. But the Coxes lived up the other side of Uncle John, and they had a big barn that was on the lake side of the road. A small jut of property. They built a big barn on it, and the upper floor of that barn was a dance floor.
So is that like where Thompson Lane comes down from the lake?
Yes, it's right across from that.
Okay.
But that barn, of course, was torn down later years.
So that was Cox's barn?
Cox's. That was the name of the people that owned the property when I was a real little kid,
Where was their house?
across the road
So it was
from the barn.
Ethel May, where Ethel May Wilder's house is, was probably
Ethel May is a cousin.
because
mine.
didn't your grandfather Dillinger build the house that's on the corner of Thompson?
Yes, he did.
And then he
but
passed
did that.
away.
Uncle George built that.
Uncle George. Okay.
That was Ethel May's grandfather.
Yeah.
He built that when his wife was too ill to do the boarding house anymore. And boarding house customers were waning anyway at that point. He built that, and she died about a year after they moved in. So that was Uncle George's place. But it was on the old Cox property, I think. Then, that was the second dance hall. The barn had that big dance floor upstairs. You go further at the head of the lake then, that was Allen's. That was called the Lake House, and it was a boarding house, just like the other three. And then you go around, there was empty property until you get around to the corner, and there was, I think his name was Vetter or Wetter.
Wetter. Yeah.
He built a big place, and he was interested in horses, I think.
Yes, he was.
Yeah. He built a big place, and he rented it out, because Harry Dennis and his wife Florence, and their kids, Catherine Dennis was my age, Joe Dennis was Helene's age. They lived there for a short time before they went down on Layton Road. You go on around, and the Gary and Carrie Ward, friends of my grandmother, built a house that the Houcks, when they sold the lakeside house, moved into when Gary and Carrie Ward died. They moved into that house. So it was Dottie Harrison's grandmother, Mrs. Houck, that owned that place.
Now, where was that?
In the early 1940s.
Which house is that?
It's a white house. It was the only one after Vetter's, I think. I don't know about any houses in between.
Was it where? Oh, was it like a two-story colonial type
Yes,
house? Or
yes,
that's
it was
probably
a white house.
Yeah, or probably that's probably
that
Quayle's
used
house.
to be Gary and Carrie Ward's. They
Okay.
never had any children, and she was a very good friend of Grandma. She was over at our house a lot when I was 5 and 6 and 7 in that age. Then you go on to the Sutherland place,
Right.
which was the oldest stone house around. I don't know much on the history of that, except I remember when Mrs. Glassford and her husband bought that, and she used to read palms. She did my sister Jean, she did Anne, she took my hand, she looked at it and she said, "I'm not going to do yours." And she wouldn't, she never would. I don't know what she saw or what she thought she saw, but she wasn't going to read my palm. And then Losie Ferris lived over there for a while. I think he made booze, I think, during the Prohibition, but I'm not sure of that either. Just seems familiar. Then you go on around. There was the final dance hall was a gambling place on the lake, just below what they used to call Chinese Alley, that area. And up on the hill, lakeside, was his house. And we kids it was closed down by the time I was born. And we used to go over and walk on the dock. And the dock led out, and off the dock on the land side was small rooms with round poker tables, and some of them had a full mirror across from the door. Of course, they were all falling down when we kids were over there snooping. And I remember my older sister and I were over there. I guess I must have been 7 and she was probably 8. And I'm in one place and she's going down the dock. All of a sudden she screamed. I thought, oh my God, what happened to her? So I go to see what happened to Helene. She had gone through a doorway to one of these small gambling rooms, and there was a full-length mirror on the other side. She thought it was somebody else. There was somebody in there. So we settled that. Then those were all torn down. But I remember a man from Stanfordville fell off rocks across from that house on the road and killed himself. What was his name? Nick something or other?
Yep. But Barbarian. I want to say his name was Barbarian.
I think maybe they thought at the time he got pushed.
They thought it was a murder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that was. I remember my grandmother talking about that. And then you come around, it was empty until you got to another Allen, which was a little white house on the right, beyond the lake, beyond the foot of the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And Clem Knickerbocker lived next to her, Mrs. Allen. Now, Clem Knickerbocker and his two sisters lived in that house. And he rented property right across from our house. His farmland came right down to the pond where the horses used to drink. Mm-hmm. And I remember being astonished because if they had a sick farm animal, they brought him in the kitchen. They even brought a horse in one day. He was ill, so they brought him in the house to tend. He was put behind the kitchen stove to keep warm. So I thought that was crazy, but. And then then there was the elementary schoolhouse, the little schoolhouse that I went to for 8 years. And that was a great education for little kids, for any kid, because you soon learned to tolerate everybody. If you wanted to play a game, you needed everybody. So you had to live with everybody, regardless of who they were, what they looked like, or anything else. So it was a very good training ground for tolerance. I always appreciated that because I thought of so many kids when I got to high school, this bunch and that bunch and the other bunch, which didn't interest me that much because I like people. And let me see. I think I remember when the gambling house across the lake burned.
I was just going to ask you that because that happened after the man fell.
Yes, they sort of were tied together.
Right.
I don't know what was going on, but something was going on anyway. But I vaguely remember looking out our windows and my grandmother saying something like, "It must be the so-and-so place." So I guess it was, but I remember the sky was all lit up with fire across the lake, which was interesting to a kid.
Yeah, because they had suspicions because certain people had seen a couple of cars there.
Yeah, somebody set it on fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that was
They thought maybe there was something going on either with bootlegging or the gambling.
Yeah.
And that guy somehow or other was tied into it, the guy that had gotten with the head injury.
Well, then there was the German murders.
Mm-hmm.
That was I was 7, I think. So it was 1930, or that era. And I remember a lot of talk about it. And I know that Monday when we went to school, or it could have been the Friday after Thanksgiving, it was one of those days, the entire community at Huns Lake heard about it. And my stepmother got in the car, drove up, and took us all out of school, and Mrs. Carpenter, the teacher, took the other batch. So she brought the Lake kids home, and Mrs. Carpenter took the Laytons and the Dennises and anybody else that was down in that area. And Elmer Devine's store sold out of padlocks immediately. Everybody was locking their doors.
They were
Nobody
so
knew
fearful.
what was going on.
Yeah.
And A.J. Curry was arrested for that murder. And there was a lot of background. My father and stepmother were friends with A.J. Curry and his wife. And we were told to go and play with Peggy when they came down. But of course, A.J. was doing booze, like so many during Prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And my father knew where all these places were, but they were good friends. They'd go down and play cards. And when he was arrested, I remember the talk in our house about how he had come home that afternoon late to his home, and his wife, no, she was not married to him at the time, but she lived with him, and they had a daughter, Peggy. And she said to him, "What have you been doing?" Because he was covered in a white apron that was covered with blood. And he said, "I butchered a whole batch of chickens." And she said, "Well, give me your clothes, I'll wash them." So she did. Now, she went on the witness stand and told that story. And in order to prevent her from testifying any further, he married her. And then she could not testify.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I have a written record of a man later on who evaluated that whole time and all of the people that were suspected. Mary Nemus's brother was suspected of it at one time. Any transient, any farm worker, they were all looked at. But this whole transcript, which I have a copy of, decided at the end that it was inevitable that with the evidence that everybody had and knew, A.J. Curry was as guilty as of the murder. The older girl, the older German girl, was going to Poughkeepsie to a secretarial school. And coming home on Haggerty's bus, she told Haggerty when he stopped at her corner, "I don't want to get off. I don't want to go home. Something is awfully wrong." He says, "For heaven's sake, it's Thanksgiving weekend. You have to get off, because I'm not going to make another run for 3-4 days." So she got off and she walked right into the murderer, and she was the last one killed, I think. The young boy was limited mentally in some fashion, the German boy, and he would have gotten away if he'd run across the fields to somebody's house, but he was in the farmyard, and he just went around and around the wagon until the murderer caught him and killed him. Killed the father in the barn, the mother in the house, and the daughter was in the house. So I guess it's still an unsolved case, but the consensus of opinion from professionals and laymen alike at the time resulted in this book that this guy wrote. Oh yes, in the elementary school? Yes, Louetta Dennis and Paul Dennis. They were the older ones. My Layton, Bill Layton, I can remember, I think it was Bill, and Henry Carpenter. The two of them were in the 8th grade, and of course I was probably in the 1st grade, but I was so impressed because Bill ate a whole piece of pie behind his desk, and the teacher didn't even know it. But he and Henry Carpenter always got into some kind of trouble. And of course Myron followed right in their tracks. And then there was the Joe Dennis, Catherine Dennis, Dorothy Dennis, Henry Dennis, and then we had Irwin Lawrence came in. Irwin had a great voice, but he was so shy, and he would sing only if he could look out the window. And so he'd stand with his back to us in the school, look out the window and sing all these old cowboy songs. He could sing nicely. We thought he was great. And then there was Harlan Zeno. And then there was Harry Orfel, who lived up with Mrs. Arnold. Harry was from New York City. His child of divorce. His mother used to come to visit him. I remember her coming to visit him when he was in school. I remember we were jumping rope on the road. Must have been in 1932. When Franklin Roosevelt was running for office, probably governor at that time. I don't know when his first presidential candidacy was, but he drove up in the open car, and he waved to all. We stood at the side of the road. We were jumping rope right in the middle of the road because there was never any traffic. And he came past. He was on his way to Armenia to make a speech or something. Waved to all of us and went on his way. We were quite proud of the fact that we waved to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All the kids. Then there was Dottie Harrison and Bud Harrison, Stanley Jr. They lived with, Mrs. Houck was their grandmother. And I used to go up to the Houcks They had a fascinating house. Oh, you know who bought that house? Miss Olive Ellick, who was a Follies girl, with her paramour, Mr. McKnight. My father heard, I was about 13 when they bought that house. My father heard about it. He laid down the law. You girls are not going up and visit her. Here she was living in sin. He wasn't having anything to do with that.
Now, this was the Houck house that was between
the house, right.
Between the two Dillinger houses.
Yes.
Okay.
And I made up my mind then and there, if that lady was on stage, I was going to see her. So I did. When my father was working, I went up to see her. I wanted to welcome her. I took one of Grandma's strawberry jellies, and I gave it to her, and I said, I wanted to welcome you to the lake, and we're glad you're here, and all that sort of thing, as much as I could. Well, I got to know her very well. I used to stop by frequently. And when it was 2 years of this, I don't know whether my father ever knew or whether he decided just to not do anything. So I was never grounded for it, never called to attention for it. But when I was about 15, I was invited, my boyfriend invited me to go to one of the dances in Wings Hall, the Halloween costume dance.
Where's Wings Hall?
Wings Hall's in Clinton Corners.
Okay.
And the Chadwell family ran that. Irvin Chadwell, who I was dating at the time, he ran those dances.
Yeah.
So they put on this big, and it was a big thing. Square dances was a big thing in those years. And so I told Miss Ellick that I was invited to this costume party. She says, what are you going to wear? And I said, I haven't any idea. She says, wait a minute. She goes upstairs, comes down later. Over her arm is draped a yellow silk, pure silk and black lace with lavender lining dress. She says, take your dress off and we'll see if it fits. She put it on me, fit like it was made for me. It was absolutely gorgeous. And as Flo Ziegfeld always said, that his girls on stage always wore pure silk, everything. And this was pure silk. It was beautiful. So I had found in the attic one of my stepmother's shawls that had, it was black lace with black jets in it. I draped that over my head and down over the yellow silk with the black lace panel down the front, tucked in at the waist, tight-fitted bodice, and full skirt, shorter in the front, longer in the back, lined with lavender silk and little lavender bows in the yellow big skirt. I took first prize. I had a ball. It was wonderful. It was between me and a young lady from Poughkeepsie who was dressed as an angel. She was all in white. She was very pretty, but I won. And there must have been at least 50 to 60 women marching around, all in costume, and this one would be asked, thank you, you can sit down, thank you, you can sit down. And it was just her and me at the end. And when they asked her to sit down, I got the first prize. Well, I was so proud of myself I could fly. I couldn't wait to tell Miss Ellick. And so I did. I went up next day and told her all about it. But that was such fun. Now, on the corner of Layton Road and Huns Lake Road, there used to be an old schoolhouse. That's where my mother went to school when she was a kid.
Was that Miss Sackett's school? Was that the Sackett school?
I have no idea. All I know is that there was at one time a one-room schoolhouse there.
Now, when you say on the corner, though, was that the corner with the pond or the other corner?
It was, if you're coming from Huns Lake and turn on Layton Road, it was on the right.
Okay, so it's that corner.
It's
there was a barn there too. At one, was the barn the old schoolhouse?
There must have been. I don't remember that, but I do know my grandmother told me that that's where my mother went to elementary school. And Mrs. Carpenter had the place across the road, the big old Carpenter house, which was a stagecoach stop.
Right.
It had those big arches in the back where the stagecoach would pull in, change horses, and take off again. So that was there, and I remember when, after Mrs. Carpenter stopped teaching, she used to rent a room to the teachers that came to teach at the elementary school. And we had Miss Forshaw. And Miss Forsher was teaching us to do the Virginia reel, which requires a lot of stomping around, to be quite frank, with kids that don't know any better. So we used to go down to her house to practice, where she rented at Mrs. Carpenter's, and she would play the piano, and we'd do the Virginia reel. And Mrs. Carpenter came in and she says, "Please don't jump too hard. The floor is not that sturdy." But the house was old, my good heavens.
Was it true that that house up on the upper levels of the house was like a dance, was it like a ballroom?
I don't know. It could have been, because that seemed to be the thing to do. Also on Schumann's Road, I guess, I don't know whether you go up Leighton Road or up Bangor Road to get up on the hills up there, but there was a Schumann's Road that went through to Millbrook.
Yep.
Now, at that road, there was a man, I don't know whether his name was Schumann or not, or what it was, but he was associated with New York City gambling. I don't know, but it seemed my mother dated this son, Carl, but she never, in her diaries, never put the last name, so I don't know what his last name was. But she used to go to dances at that place, and they had a ballroom, and they had a bowling alley, and they had a game room.
Is that the house that had the two pillars at the end of the driveway?
I have no idea.
Because it's interesting, because right now they have, up in Pine Plains, they have Dutch Schultz's old place, is been turned into a distillery, basically. And we went to a lecture up there, and they were talking about Legs Diamond being associated with...
That's the one that I seem to remember hearing.
My Jeff, he always heard that it was Legs Diamond that lived up on in the area of Schumann Road, Dual Road, because Stanley Willig used to pile the kids into a a wagon of some sort when Jeff was little, and they would go on a ride to Legs Diamond's property.
Yes.
And my Jeff asked Karen Willig where they would go on the ride, and she said it was Schumann Road.
Yeah.
That was the property.
Well, that's the property I think my mother went with Aunt Lena Dillinger, the two of them.
So that would be interesting, is to look up and see what Legs Diamond's children's names were.
Yes.
Because maybe that'll solve that mystery then, if that was indeed Legs Diamond's property.
I don't know, but it's associated with Legs Diamond. I do remember that Legs Diamond name, because diamond stuck in my head. I was just a little kid.
Yeah.
But reading my mother's diary is when I realized that's the place she went to a dance with her boyfriend.
Now, are those the diaries that you gave me? That would be in one of those
Yes.
diaries? All right, I'll reread that, looking for that specifically.
There's some time in there. She had a date with Carl. And she had several dates with Carl. But that was one of many, I guess. They lived a real active social life, my mother and her family. They were always out on skating parties, go to the dance hall, Uncle George's dance hall, all kinds of things. I remember one of the first times our church had a festival every year where they had booths and sold things like a craft show, but entertaining, and the church made money. It was held at Dillinger's Hall. And I remember the first time one of my earliest memories, I don't know how old I was, but Grandma and Mother went and took us children. Helene went, she walked, I walked, and I think Mama was carrying Jean in her arms, because Jean couldn't walk that far. I don't think Ann was even born yet. So that's prior to 1927. I would be 4 in 1927 when Ann was born. It was prior to that, but it was the summer before, so I could have been pushing 4 years old. But I had a blue silk dress with ribbons at the shoulder that came down to the hem. And it was the prettiest dress, and I thought, and little Mary Jane shoes, I thought I was Esther's pet horse. So, as my grandmother's saying. So off we went. So we enjoyed it. But then 4 or 5 little girls, all dressed in dance costumes, with little ballet shoes on, formed a circle and were doing different dances. And my mother says, "Mary, you can go and do with them." And I thought, oh, wouldn't that be fun? So I went out and I grabbed a hand on each side. They made room for me. They started off, and of course, with my patent leather shoes, I slipped on the dance floor and fell down. I was so embarrassed, I got up and I wouldn't do it anymore. I went and sat with my mother. But I can remember being so humiliated that I fell down. But of course, their shoes didn't slip. They were ballet shoes with the proper soles. So, and I remember walking home that night, holding my mother's hand. I have very few memories of my mother because she died when I was 5. She died that Christmas. But I was holding her hand. Grandma had Helene, and again, I guess little Jean was in Mom's arms. And we walked home, and it must have been a full moon because it was the most beautiful night. And all the stars, billions of stars were out. And it was just so much fun. But that's one of my only memories with my mother and the activities at the lake. Uncle George's had he had ice cream parlor plus the dance floor. And it wasn't until Brewster bought it when Uncle George sold out and moved up to his new home. Brewster bought it and he put in a bar and I think it was beer just to start.
Now, which one was your grandfather, though? Or there was John Dillinger, George Dillinger.
They were all my grandmother's brothers. They were great uncles.
Okay.
Because their father was George, who emigrated from Germany. And I looked it up on Ancestor.com or whatever. And they had it wrong. They had the ages wrong. My grandmother was, let's see, 1860. My grandmother was between 6 and 8, I don't remember. And her two older, all the brothers were older than she was. She was the youngest. And his immigration papers are 1866. But I never could find George Sr.'s gravestone. And I climbed through Smithfield, where they originally settled, at Smithfield Road between Huns Lake and Tuamenia, that road, on the corner.
By the church.
No, down from the church was a yellow house that is now replaced with a big brick place with a big brick wall around it. That is where George Dillinger settled with Elizabeth, his wife, and my grandmother and her brothers. And they were there until they moved to Huns Lake when Grandma's mother was widowed, and she married John Smith and moved to Huns Lake. My mother was 2 or 3 years old, and Uncle John was a year old, or 2, in that period of time. They were there at the lake, but I never knew how George died, when he died, or what happened. I've never been able to find any information.
When you say the big house with the brick, is that on Huns Lake Road on the way down? It's like a big hill that goes down, and the place has got a big brick wall.
Yes, that's it. That's the property.
And then, because at the bottom of the hill would be Pugsley Hill Road, and then there's a cemetery in there on the left.
Yeah, I climbed through that one, too.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find it. Jean and I climbed through that cemetery.
Because I know there's Dillingers in the cemetery.
Up by the church.
By Smithfield, yeah.
Yeah, that's where John Smith is buried, and Elizabeth, Grandma's mother, who was Elizabeth Dillinger Smith.
Uh-huh.
And Uncle John is up there, and his first wife, Helen, and their child that died young, she's there, and Anna Kruger's there, which was John Dillinger's wife's sister, who stayed on as his housekeeper when she died. Anna Kruger was there for years before she went. And then, of course, Al Dillinger, John's son, moved in when I was about 11 or 12. Moved into the John Dillinger house. And they took over the farm and the whole 9 yards. They weren't a boarding house at that time.
Huh.
They had so many, they had 9 kids.
Yeah.
The lake was as it is now when I was a kid. And my grandmother who was before me, said she used to take a dishpan to the falls, the dam outlet, and catch a dishpan full of eels for a fish meal. So she did that.
And the falls was down by your house, by the big barn.
The other side of the road was the big falls.
Right.
Yeah.
Where were the small falls?
Well, it was the dam. The outlet from the dam was just a little
that went into your pond.
spillway.
That went into your pond.
Went into the creek, and then went down to our pond. The creek ran through the meadow.
So so that lake then was the full length. That would have been before 1900.
Before 1923, when I was born, because Grandma did this, and she didn't do it when I was around.
Yeah, because I always heard that it spilled over. That it was.
I know I never heard of any discussion among the adults that would clue me in as to it was smaller before they did something and made it bigger.
Right.
The dam was always there, and that's where my grandmother used to catch eels. And she was there in the house at the time my mother, say, was 4 years old.
What grandmother is that now?
Grandmother Dillinger.
Grandma Dillinger.
Simon, really. She married a Simon.
Huh.
Mary Helena Dillinger.
Mary Helena.
She always went by Lena.
Hmm.
And Ethel May's mother was Helena Dillinger.
Right.
Married, a name for my grandmother, I guess.
And she became Houts, right? Didn't she? Was she Helena Houts?
Yeah. Then some of our boarders built little houses between Uncle George's place and the head of the lake, Allen's house, on that side. All those small cottages.
Right.
McCarthy built one.
They were a boarder at your house?
Not McCarthy's, but Charlie
Schultz.
He and his wife used to come to our house when their first baby was little, because Helene and I would argue about who was going to push the baby in the baby carriage. Of course, Helene always won, because she was Miss Know-It-All anyway. Yep, they came and stayed every summer. And people came back year after year, the same families. By train, we'd take the three-seated Surrey, and the horse would go down to the train, pick up the boarders and bring them and their trunks up to the house, and the women would stay all summer while the men came weekends. They'd work in New York City, come up by train and stay the weekend and go home in time to go to work on Monday morning. So there was a busy train service.
But when you were a kid, it was basically starting to go out of being a summer.
It lasted through my stepmother's time. We had boarders always when I was in high school. That's 37 through 41, those years. But then it began to really wane, the impact. Some old standbys would come. The Vandelfs, the Doyles, the Nelsons, the O'Briens. Those were people that came when I was a baby, and they came right through my high school years. Every summer they came. So we were open for those people who would return.
Did you ever go to like any of the parties? Like I have newspaper articles that I printed about different parties that were at the houses, like at the Maples. I have one in particular I can't tell you the person's name, but he basically had like a surprise party for his wife. And the way they described it, they had like Chinese lanterns hanging in the trees. They were playing croquet on the lawn. You know, it's just so, you could just picture the whole activity when you read the article.
I told you they were very social.
Yeah.
But that's before my time.
That was before.
That's more my mother's time. Although she never mentions Chinese lanterns and stuff.
Yeah, it's in that
My
one.
grandmother, anybody sick anywhere around the lake, she'd go to Mrs. Allen. I don't know whether it was head of the lake Allen's, but I think it was the other Allen up near Clem Knickerbocker, who was ill. She'd go over there and do her wash and take her food to her and take care of her for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And she was always going someplace to help out. And Graham had quilting bees at the house. because early on, Jean and I weren't very old, but Grandma had the ladies at the house, and they all brought their quilts, and then they'd put them on the quilt frame and tie them. They didn't quilt them stitch by stitch. They tied them down and up and tie, down and up and tie, so that the batting stayed inside the quilt material.
Mm-hmm.
And Jean and I watched them do this one day. We got a hold of a pair of scissors and got under the quilt. And every time a needle came down and up, and they tied it, we snipped it. I don't remember what happened, but I remember one lady saying, "But Lena, they're all pulling out." I think we left. And that was the end of that. But that Stanley Willig has some of the history. He has slides. He came to Millbrook once and showed them. And he has a slide of the big chestnut tree in our yard, but he has the wrong place for it. He said it was in one of the other yards. That huge chestnut tree it was a horse chestnut, had 3 trunks grown together and then branching out. It was huge, and it was gorgeous when it was in blossom. We kids picked up, Jean and I, picked up a bunch of horseshoes, horse chestnuts, and decided that since we'd heard about roasting chestnuts in a Christmas song, we wondered what they taste like. Well, Mom and the workers were in the kitchen, my stepmother, cooking a big dinner. The stove was hot, on a wood stove. The oven was hot, but they were cooking on top. Must have been steak or something like that. Jean and I got a handful of these horse chestnuts, snuck in the kitchen when nobody was looking, dropped them in the oven and shut the door. It wasn't too long. The oven door flew open, and horse chestnuts were like lethal objects exploding all over the kitchen. Well, it was mayhem then, but I don't remember any aftermath. Once again, I think we just left and let the tumult simmer down. But those were times that we had a good upbringing, in spite of the fact we lost our mother so young, and I never recovered from that, because the stepfamily was not, well, in the first place, Naomi Valentine Girk, who married my father, I don't think she realized she was getting 4 little girls. She thought she was going to tie pinafores on us and hair ribbons and sit down and have tea parties. Well, the boarding house was a bit too busy for tea parties, and those 4 little girls turned out to be absolute monsters. At butchering time, the men would come from around the lake and butcher our pigs. Then we'd go to John Dillinger's and butcher. Then they'd go over to Ike Bird's and butcher. And they did it different days, different weekends. And I can remember when my stepmother was a new bride, and we asked Dad, "Can we go up and watch them butcher the pigs?" He said, "Ask your mother, new mother." So we went to her and asked her. She looked at my father and she says, "Do they always do things like this?" She was horrified that anybody would want to watch that. But that's what we did. We went along and watched. And of course, at John Dillinger's was where they made the bloodwurst, sausage, and all that sort of thing, all that food that they put away for the winter. It was part of the process of growing your own. We were self-sufficient. Grandma never threw anything out. She would pick wild strawberries in a huge dish pan. Fill it half full, because I had to go and help her pick occasionally. And then she'd make strawberry jam. We had all kinds of things. The only thing we did not have sheep or goats. We had pigs, we had cows, we had a horse or a pair of horses, depending on the time. Ducks, chickens, and the ducks on the pond were a tourist attraction, more or less. We had it was good, and of course we were friends with everybody on the lake, and the kids would gather, end up at one house or the other, on a weekend. And there we learned the hotel business is what we grew up in, because we had to take part. Gene and I waited tables, and we had 35 people in the dining room at 3 tables, big tables, extension tables, and she'd have a table and I'd have a table, and we'd share one, and they would sometimes leave us a tip, and I bought most of my clothing all through high school and made my own clothes. Grandma was a seamstress. She made all our clothes when we were little. Our coats, everything we wore. She knit the sweaters. And when a sweater my father had a sweater that the elbows got holes in, she'd unravel it and make him a vest. So she never wasted anything. It was good training for the years that were coming. The crash of '29 didn't affect us very much. We had plenty of food on the table. Grandma made all our clothes out of leftovers, and nobody at the lake knew there was such a thing as want, which was incredible when there were so many bread lines in New York City and things like that. We didn't have glitzy things, but we always managed right through the Depression. So it was a good life, in spite of sadnesses. My mother, Anna Dillinger Simon Freer. She was born in the Smithfield house to George and Anna Dillinger. No, her mother was born of George and Anna. Let me get my book and read it, because that's more accurate. George Dillinger married Elizabeth Getz. They were both born in Germany. They had 4 children: Frank, John, George, and Mary Helena. Mary Helena was born in Germany, but brought over here with her family when she was 8. She was my grandmother. She married Alexander Simon. Her children were John Joseph and Anna Meta. Anna Meta was my mother. My mother was Anna Meta Simon. Her grandmother was a Dillinger. She married Harry Freer and had 4 girls, of which I was one, the second one. Helene Marie, Mary Elizabeth, Jean Harriet, and Anne Irenita. So that's the background of my mother. Goes from me to my mother, to my grandmother, who was a Dillinger and married a Simon, to the emigre, or whatever you call them, George Dillinger.
Okay, so if she was in Smithfield, she grew up in that house.
Yes, my grandmother, she was there until she married, I think, because she came to Huns Lake, to the old homestead, when apparently George, her father, the man who came from Germany, died, and his wife, Elizabeth Groats, married John Smith, who owned the lake house, which is what it was called at that time.
So the lake house is the old homestead?
Yes. And my mother was about 4, in the only thick picture I have of her with her mother, Mary Helena, her great-grandmother, Elizabeth Getz, and John Smith. And they remained at that house. When John and Elizabeth died, The house was willed to my grandmother, Mary Helena Dillinger Simon. And she raised her children there, and I was born there in that house, because when my father married Anna, my mother, he moved to the house. She did not move out, and they continued to run the boarding house as the old homestead.
Now, why did they make the change in the name? Do you know that?
No, but I know it was called the Lake House, which I thought originally was what Allen's called theirs. Maybe they picked up the name after John Smith dropped it. It was done in John Smith time. It was changed then, apparently, because my grandmother ran it as the old homestead. Lena Simon, proprietor, on the envelopes and the letterhead.
Wow.
So that's my mother's history.
And then what about Mr. Simon?
Alex Simon, he and his brother had a store in Hopewell Junction, and they failed at that and moved to, I think, Pine Plains or someplace. Started again, lost that. And he was at the old homestead with my grandmother for a short time, but he was in the barn working or doing something. He was not quite right mentally. He was in Hudson River State Hospital for a period of time. And when he came back, he went to live with his wife, my grandmother. And when he was in the haymow, he jumped out of the haymow and landed on a pitchfork and killed himself.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So he died there when my mother was quite young.
Was that like in the 5-story barn that happened?
No, that was the mill that was 5 stories. The barn was 1, 2, and the 2 stories of the haymow.
Is that the barn? Is the barn the building that was up the road from where that?
Up behind the wagon house, up on top on the right, was the big old barn.
So there should be remnants of that barn up there then.
There should be a foundation of some sort, because the cattle, the cow stanchions, were in the lower part, and you came out of that cow door and walked up a hill up to where the horses were kept on the 2nd floor.
Oh.
And then the haymow.
So it was kind of built into the hillside.
It was built into the hills, yes.
You should go look for
There
that.
were 2 horse stalls with a big box stall on that floor. The box stall was when the horses had foals, and they were in the bigger section.
So did you have 1 horse, 2 horses?
As far as I knew, when I was born, we only had 1. We had Duke, and he drove the wagons down to get the boarders and all over. Artie drove.
Now, the Artie that you refer to, who's Artie?
Artie is a boy that my grandmother, Lena Dillinger Simon, took out of the poorhouse, or what the children's home they called in Poughkeepsie.
Okay, that's.
He was 13 when he came to her, which was before I was born. He was there when Helene was born, so he knew her from birth. He lived with us until he died, and he took us girls when we were little. He took us on picnics. He taught us to skate. He took us sleigh riding. We took hikes through the woods. He was keeping us out from under the women's feet as they prepared for boarders,
right,
cooking and what have you.
He was like a big brother almost to you guys.
Oh, he was like a very loved uncle or brother or whatever.
What was his last name?
Royer, R-O-Y-E-R. I think he came from Canada, but he skated like a dream. He had racing skates, and he taught us to skate, and he could outskate anybody on the lake, and that was a lot of people. And he died when I was 9. He only had 1 kidney, and the other one went bad. And of course, this was well before kidney transplants and kidney machines and all of that. So he just died. I remember the day he died. I came home from school, and stepmother told us that Artie had died in the hospital. I immediately went upstairs to Artie's room and took his photograph album. Funny, nobody ever said a word about it being missing. I just took it downstairs and kept it. And to this day, it is full of pictures of us when we were 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 years old.
Really?
Mostly of Helene and I, but Jean got in the act when she was 3. She went on hikes with us and the rest of it. He took pictures of all of us. And Anne went up till she was about a year old. But that album, now, my granddaughter, Kelly Thompson Freer, Kelly and her partner both decided they would take the last name of Freer to be part of the family. Her mother was the daughter of, well, her mother was my daughter, but she was always enamored by Freer and the history of the Huguenots and the settlement, the house in New Paltz. So she took the name of Freer. So she has my album that was Artie's.
Where does she live?
In Washington State.
Oh, that's the girl. Okay.
Yeah, she and her twin sister Kim. They're both out there.
That's great.
So that's the story of the old homestead. It was, my stepmother sold it when I was 21, I think. And I always regretted that I didn't have a place to take the few pieces of furniture that really meant something to me. They were beautiful pieces. But she sold the house furnished, so we couldn't take anything.
Who did she sell the house to?
People named, I think it was the Robinsons.
So it went to the Robertsons. Okay.
Yeah. Now, Brian is the grandson of the Robinsons.
Right.
And he was the one that gave me the pictures of the early pictures of the groups in front of the lake house, when it was the lake house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he has a lot of the Hyatt pictures.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. He was, I've seen him a couple of times, talked to him when I was down in Stanfordville, stopped at his shop. Yeah. But I'd love to know where George Dillinger grave is. I don't know that.
Did they ever bury anyone right there at the lake house? Is there a
no,
old cemetery?
That George would be Smithfield.
No, I know, but just the time frame?
No, not that I know of, because Elizabeth, George Dillinger's wife, who later married John Smith, John and that Elizabeth are in the Smithfield Church Cemetery, across from the church in Smithfield.
I'm going to go over there. I'll try to go over in the next few weeks and take some pictures of those stones for you.
Because John, I have photographs of John's.
Do you?
Okay. Yeah, and I have all the pictures of those somewhere in my memorabilia.
Huh.
So
we're looking for George Dillinger. The patriarch, basically, of your family.
Yeah, George came over. That's his immigration papers.
Yeah.
He was naturalized in October of 1866, I think it is.
Do you know what year he died in?
No, I don't know anything about his birth, his death, or anything. I surmise he was born around 1822, and his death was 1875. Going from photographs I have of the groups in front of the old house when Elizabeth married John.
And he's missing. He's missing from the pictures.
Oh, he isn't there. He was gone because my grandmother was there with my mother at 4 and Uncle John at 2. But she was married to John Smith at that time. So where George is, he must have died in the Smithfield house at some time, but I cannot find records.
No, where was the house in Smithfield, though?
That was at the foot of the hill from the Huns Lake Road going towards Amenia. Going down the hill.
And you said it was past the house with there's the place that has the brick wall.
Yeah, that's that big place at the foot of the hill.
Right.
There was an old graveyard with a lot of Thompsons, because they call that Thompson's Hill, I think.
The square. They called it the square.
Thompson Square?
Thompson Square,
Well,
yeah.
that's...
It's like right direct. That cemetery you're talking to is directly across from where Huns Lake Road comes into Route 83.
Yes.
Okay. So the house was right there?
Right there on that little dirt road. It was a dirt road when I was there.
Right.
Now I don't know what it is.
So there's that. So there's that cemetery there, and then there's the one at the bottom of Pugsley Hill. If you go like where the house is that has the brick wall, there's a road that cuts in there.
Pugsley Hill.
That's Schieffer Road, which leads you to. That's where the other cemeteries.
House with a brick wall around it is almost on the site of the yellow clapboard house that was George's and Anna's originally.
Was it one story?
I don't know. I have no idea. I don't.
So did they have two houses then out that way? They had the one that's
just the one.
Just the
that
one.
I know of.
Because the house with the brick wall actually is on the corner. That would lead you to the corner of where Schieffer, which is the lead.
That's that brick house with the wall. Because I went over looking at the graveyard that is near that brick house.
Right.
I crawled through that with Jean, my sister.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't find George Dillinger anywhere. But I know that one of the fields that it was pasture lots like had burial stones of Thompson's children. One of the gravestones said, "Behold and see, as you are now, I was once, as I am now, you soon will be. Prepare for death and follow me."
Oh my God.
But those stones are all gone, and the field is reverted to God knows what. Maybe there's a house built on it. I don't know.
Now, where was that field?
There's a monument up there on Pugsley Hill or whatever they called it.
Carpenterville.
There's a monument of some kind. Now, I have gravestones. Hold on while I get... Oh, God knows where they are. But I think I know. With genealogy. Dillinger Jr. died in France. He married Anna Gardner. And this says George Dillinger Sr. His father was my Uncle George, brother of
John.
Mary Helena.
And John, right?
And John, yeah.
Right. And they're the ones that lived in the Cliff House. This, Anna Gardner and George Dillinger Sr. lived in the Cliff House.
That's right.
Right.
Lena Dillinger, that's my grandmother.
Okay.
And Artie Royer.
Now, where is this? Is this
is in Bangor, behind Immaculate Conception Church.
Okay.
All right, so they're in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that's where that is. That's the same one.
Is that behind the Catholic Church too?
That's up on, that's the cemetery behind the United Church of Christ.
Here, I have two of those.
Okay.
You can have
Because
one.
we made sure, we make sure that he's got the veteran marker on him.
Okay.
And
Well,
also, his father, their Dillingers were involved in the firehouse too, so we make sure there's markers on them.
This is Frank Dillinger.
That's Smithfield, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, I've seen that stone.
Yeah. So that, and his wife. And this is also Dillinger. This is Alfred, which was George's son.
Right.
He married Aunt Marie. That's people that I lived with. This is Aubrey Chadwell
And Marie.
and Marie.
Yeah.
That's Frank again. You can have one of those.
Okay, that's Smithfield.
And this is Alfred, a son of John. Simon. That's Uncle Johnny Simon. That is across from the Congregational, that church across from was the market, and then there's a church there, and the post office was there in Stanfordville.
There, it
Across-
was
Across from that was a church.
by Elvin's.
Yeah. Yeah.
Friends, isn't that the Friends?
Oh, the Friends Church?
Yeah, well, whatever it is now. Anyway, Uncle John is on the hill behind that. Wilders, this is
That's
Ethel May.
Yep, that's her, yeah.
Lyle, that's me. No, that's Bob's family.
Now, where are they?
They're
They're in-
he was born Elizaville? I'm not sure. It's outside of Pine Plains.
So Evergreen, maybe? Somewhere
Yeah.
that way?
That's Chet Lyle's wife, putting flowers on the grave. This is Roy Vanessa Lyle. This is That's my husband's mother, And that's the church in that little place, the Vetter Church.
Oh, okay, I know what you mean.
One of Bob's, I think his grandfather was the pastor there.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Freer. This is my father, my mother. Yeah.
Now, where are they?
They're at Immaculate Conception, Bangor.
They're in Bangor, too.
With Grandma. Kruger. Here's John Kruger. This is Anna's father. Because there's Anna Kruger, who was sister of John Dillinger's wife.
Okay.
He married Helen Kruger.
Mm-hmm.
Frank. There's another Frank. Do you have a Frank? Yes.
Yeah, I have a Frank there, yeah.
Harry Freer again. Now this is Elizabeth Smith and John Smith. You can't read any of it, but that's the tall one is John Smith. That's where I discovered it was spelled Smidth.
Now, where is that up in the United
That's
Church of Christ?
across the Smithfield Church.
Oh, okay,
up on the
Smithfield.
hill. I don't think I have another one of those.
Harry Girk.
That's my stepbrother.
Harry Girk?
Yeah, he's still alive, but his
Yep,
wife is there.
Burn, yeah.
She was a Dillinger.
Yep. Now, why do you say that's just your stepbrother?
He's my stepbrother.
How was he your stepbrother?
He was my stepmother's son when she married my father. He came with her.
All right, Harry. Okay, so you're. Oh, is that Naomi? You said.
Yes.
So Naomi is Harry Girk's mother.
Yes.
Oh, I never put two and two together.
The step family.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's who they were.
So that's the connection to the Girks.
Yes, because Naomi's first husband was Girk, Harry Girk. She married Harry Girk, Harry Freer, and Harry, the gas station man in Stanford there. Decker. Harry Decker. And that's Ethel Mays. Here's Dillinger. This is, I don't know who.
Is that Alfred?
I don't know. Do I got two of them? No, this is...
I think this is Alfred. This one might be Alfred.
Yeah, that could be that.
So that's Sonny, right? Young Al they called him Sonny.
Oh, yes. And that's the Chadwells. And that's Simon again. Wilders, Goik, Houts, Dillinger, John, and Helen. You have that one?
No. I don't know if you have another one of them. Make sure you have one.
I think I have. That's more of George. I think I have a John, but I'm not sure. You can have the John one if I've got another one.
My husband told Mickey Dillinger's son that I was coming up to see you. Michael, he has a son, Michael.
Yes.
He's on the fire company with us, and Jeff saw him last week one day, and he told Mike I was coming up to see you.
Yes. Is Mickey still alive?
No, Mickey passed away.
Well, the kids don't know me.
No, he told Jeff he didn't know who you were. So.
No, I don't have a double of that.
That's okay. I'll go take some shots too. Of this and put them in the book.
Okay, I've given you all my doubles.
Yeah, they're great.
That's
Thank
my
you.
records of pictures of them.
All right, I was just wondering a couple of things though as I'm sitting here. Like, did you have at the old homestead when you had the boarders? Did you have people that helped your mom besides
Yes.
Art? His
Yes.
name's Art, right? Royer.
Yes, but they didn't live there. Grace Brennan worked there. Florence German worked there. A summer help waited on tables when I was a little kid. And there was a Grace Hand who was there at the time of my mother's death. And she took care of us kids. And she'd offer to read to us. But she had a voice like Andy Devine. She had, I guess she had a terrible goiter or something, but her voice was so raspy. She'd read, I'd sit there and I'd listen. And that I'd get a headache because I couldn't listen anymore. It just grated on my nerves, that poor girl, and she was working so hard at entertaining us. It was terrible, but I had to leave. I could not take it. I remember that because she was the sweetest thing and took care of us when we were, well, during the time of my mother's death. And she helped my grandmother in the house. I think she might have lived with us. I don't remember. Then later on, when Naomi, my stepmother, ran the business, we had Mrs. Woods, and we had Ruth Olin's relatives. Her last name was Cody. She was married to Jim Cody.
Yeah.
They lived on Olin Road. Yeah. She worked for my stepmother. Also,
Was it Ann Cody?
a
Ann Cody.
Ralph, the carpenter, his wife worked at the house. And the carpenter, he worked on the house. What was his last name? Ralph. It's gone. I cannot pull it out of the files. But he worked on the house after the 1941 fire. He was the head carpenter.
Okay.
He lived in Stanfordville.
If you go to the fork in the road where the schoolhouse is, and you go down the hill, as if you're going to go that tin roof hill where the
Yes.
salamanders always were, on the right-hand side, there's remnants of a foundation there.
That could have been the original tin roof house, if that was the first one. I don't know which side, but there was a tin roofed house on that road, which is why it is called Tin Roof Hill. But that could be the house there.
It's right. It's pretty close to the road. It's not
Well-
a big foundation. It's a fairly small one.
Well,
So
it would
could
be an early home.
Yes, an early
And
home.
I don't know whether there were any on the other side of the road as there are now,
Right.
so many. But that could have been. And they built them close to the road so they didn't have to remove so much snow to get out to the
Right.
road.
Right.
So that's why they were close by.
What about stills? In like Prohibition, do you know where this old stills were?
I don't know where they were, but I knew A.J. Curry had booze. Whether he made it himself or whether he knew where a still was, I don't know. But I know he had.
Did you ever hear that there was a still at the house, like a carpenter's house at the intersection of Layton and Hunslake Road? The big old house there?
I didn't. I never heard that. That would have been. Well, I was a kid during Prohibition, but my father never stopped at that house, if that's any indication, because he knew where they all were. I'm sure that most of the men in Stanfordville
Knew where they were.
and the area knew exactly where they were,
Yeah.
but I don't. I just know that A.J. Curry did have booze, and of course he was the Jamon murder suspect.
Right. Yeah. Did you ever go on the train?
No. I went to meet the train with Artie when we picked up boarders, but I never rode on it. I don't think it ever occurred to me to do so. I don't know why I didn't. I don't think anybody did. It wasn't for joyriding, it was for bringing boarders from New York City.
When you finished school at the Hunslake School, did you go
Yes.
up to Pine Plains for like high school?
Yes, yes.
And who picked you up and brought you there?
Mrs. Alf. She had a station wagon car which would seat, I think there were 5 or 7 of us. There was Paul Dennis, Dottie Harrison, Brud Harrison, me, Helene, and Jean too, I think, at time. But Anne was 4 years younger than me, so I was a senior when she came in as a freshman. So the kids around the lake she took. And when she couldn't drive, Eddie Alf drove.
And they lived in the farmhouse down.
The Alf farm that is still there, I think.
Right, yeah, they renovated and restored it. Yep.
Yeah.
It's all worked
Because
over.
is that where Charlie Alf
Yes.
lives?
Yeah. That's where he
Charlie
lived.
was
yeah.
Ed's brother.
And Charlie and Grace off. There was Grace. She lived in that house there. She stayed there until she passed
She
away.
married Charlie.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And Eddie built a house there too. But down near the spring house. There used to be a spring house right on the road. wonderful water. And one time Artie had me and Helene in the wagon. He'd gone to Bangor for groceries, and we went along. Coming home, we got, before you get to the Alf farmhouse, on the left, close to the road, is this wonderful spring.
Was it where the stream comes through?
I suppose so. I don't remember the stream or anything.
Because I think that's pretty much where their driveway is up to their house is pretty much where the
Well,
stream
it probably, it's long gone, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But then it was actually had a little house built over a spring. The house was on a foundation, and you could walk on the foundation, which was only about 6 inches alongside all this beautiful puddle of spring water. So we stopped to get a drink. Artie wanted a drink. He was hot driving. So I was cramped on one of these narrow foundations, and I leaned over to get a drink and fell in. And it was the coldest water I ever fell in. It didn't bother me, but it was cold. So Artie wrapped me up in his jacket. We had to get eggs at Layton's and then go home. But I'll never forget falling headfirst into that water. It was so cold. But it was beautiful, clear water. And it was a regular puddle in there where everybody came to get their water, I guess.
Did you go to school with Marilyn Boyce?
Marilyn who?
Boyce?
Oh, yes, Marilyn. She lived in the Boyce house across from her grandfather's home. The little Margaret and Grant Boyce with Marilyn and Grant and Donald. The three of them. And the big farmhouse was the other side. I used to walk down to spend the afternoon with Marilyn. We'd play in the barns and stuff. Yeah, they were good friends.
She was.
Whoever lived there was a man and his wife, and they raised pigs. And one day he went out, killed a pig, brought it in his basement, cut it all up, and stuffed it in mason jars. He was loonier than loony. Then he decided he took his knife, after he got the pig all in jars, he would get his wife and put her in jars. And she ran screaming down to Uncle John's house, and Uncle John gathered the men in the community, Uncle George and whoever else was around, I suppose one of the Houks, and they went up and restrained him and got him into Hudson River State Hospital. I don't know who he was, but it was just he and his wife that lived there at the time. I think it was before Alan's time, which was in my early childhood.
So it would have been after Hun had it. After John Hun had it, he had
Maybe
that
it
was the
John Hun.
no he's long gone. So that because he would have been the late 1800s thereabouts, and Eliza, his wife.
Yeah.
So I wonder who had it after them.
There was a man and his wife. They could have been renting, they could have been owning. I don't have any idea who they were. But I know the wife got away from him and ran down to my Uncle John's house. And the men went back up and corralled him somehow and got him into Hudson River State Hospital.
And do you think that's who was watching you when you dug up the roses?
That was a long time after that.
Oh, okay.
That episode happened well ahead of that, before I was born.
Oh, okay.
Real early. And so I know, but when we were digging up those roads, and I didn't tell Helen, because I know she'd go screaming down to somebody and enlarge the story like you wouldn't believe, as the Dillinger trait is. They can tell a good story. But I knew, I just had a feeling that somebody was watching us dig up those roses. I brought them down, and I had them at Hun's Lake. And then there's a period when I didn't have any. But when we built the house on the Horseshoe, my husband's sister's husband, Mr. Wicker, he ran the Millbrook Supply Company store in Millbrook. That was Chauncey Wicker. Anyway, he gave me the same rose bush, yellow, from his garden. And I planted them at the Horseshoe. And they multiplied. We had a whole hedge of yellow roses along the pool. And we had the plum tree on the other side of the pool. And we swam with yellow and red, pink flower petals
Oh.
because they blew right into the pool constantly.
When you looked at the house on the north end of the lake there, the Allen house, where was the roses? Because all that was there at that time
Way
was just
down near the road,
down near the road.
almost near the road that goes up over the hill, that dirt road that's at the end there. It used to be a dirt road, but it was tucked in near the road in the front yard of the Allen house on this left side facing it. And then I took them from Horseshoe Road to Tucker Lake when I went up there and had them, a whole hedge of them up there. And then I brought them down here, and that's the rose bush that you see out in my yard, my flower bed. They've taken over. I've already given Jess a piece, and I gave Erin a piece. No, Dave, her husband, loves them. So he got a piece. So they'll go on, but they are so fragrant, and they're old. They're an old variety. I think it's what they call the Austrian briar rose. It's single. A lot of wild pink around here. Hedgerows and stuff, or pink rose bushes. And they're singles. But I like my yellow ones.